Do you find yourself ever struggling with or remarking about the way in which like things really are so over the top, or even whether it's the degree of funding or the degree of violence or the normalization of certain things? Like, I'm thinking about the process by which you're describing there, where it's like, I have to filter something because otherwise it's going to be too much, but also the reality is sort of too much, and how you titrate that for your audience.
Well, look, I mean, I like, there's a lot that didn't make it into the book that was just, on the cutting room floor that, just kind of like, it's in some sense it's more of the same, but at a certain point it's almost too much. I mean, I think that like to some degree, this is true of this book and of Badges Without Borders. It's just kind of the style of the way I do it is like, somebody once described Badges Without Borders as like a jackhammer. And I think that this book is similar. It's just like, it's really, I don't want to say repetitive because that has a certain other connotation. I hope it's not repetitive.
It's inexorable.
But it's like, yeah, exactly.
Unrelenting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Unrelenting. Exactly. But there was even more that I came across of just like police doing and saying really outrageous stuff, and as a mode of politics that, at a certain point it was like, okay, I get the point. I've gotten the point across, but also like, this is just getting kind of absurd. It's like, it is actually absurd. And one question in putting the book together was about the images. And like, I have a few images of cops protesting. Like, I wanted to have basically like a million photos of, cops protesting, and, and even like, I described this, I think there's an incident where in Detroit where like basically it's like black cops are protesting in support of Coleman Young, the mayor. And I found these photos of an incident at that protest where these white cops start beating up this black cop and like pull a gun on him. And I think they fired into the ground, like right next to him or something. And there's photos, like a series of photos documenting it, and like, so I wanted to put like so much stuff like that in it. But again, it was kind of like, okay, how many photos like this do we need to kind of like get the point across? And like, there are perhaps other photos to use that illustrate some other things, and so, but yeah, like when I've talked about the book, including when I did the event about the book in Philly, like I've made this slideshow that includes lots of photos that I didn't include in the book, and so I just let it run in the background while I'm talking. And it's, it's like cops holding up banners or posters or protesting, or then also people at protests against police brutality, just to kind of like give a sense of how this history, some of it is behind closed doors. I mean, the like operational power, political power distinction is a kind of like public-private distinction on some level. But the thing that makes police, so different, we could talk about this, is like that, just like, other unions do rallies, do demonstrations, do protests, but they don't use the operational power and force that police are able to marshal to ramify those protest tactics. So there's just something here about what police are doing that I think I didn't want to make it seem like implausible by overdoing it. There's a lot that's outrageous in the book, but it's like there's even more.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported made possible and kept ad-free for everyone, including our free listeners, by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you would like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our Journey Through the Standard Edition and our Takes Too Spicy to be in front of the paywall, please find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so pleased to introduce our guest, Stuart Schrader. Stuart is an associate professor of history and the director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of Badges Without Borders: How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. That book came out in 2019, and that was what first brought Stuart onto our radar. More recently, he is the author of Blue Power: How Police Organized to Protect and Serve Themselves, which just came out and which is going to be the subject of our conversation today. He's also the co-editor of what looks to be an incredible volume, the forthcoming Imperial Entanglements of Policing, to be published in the fall. Stuart, welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness. We're so excited to talk with you today. Both books, but the book that we're here to talk about today is just, unrelenting, but also remarkable.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I want to start by asking you a little bit about your path to the work that you do. So let me throw out a couple of questions along those lines. What are the roots of your interest in policing? So I'm interested in how you thought about the police growing up, what you've noticed about how other people think or don't think about them, and what led you to study the institution or institutions of American policing as a historian specifically?
Well, I didn't set out to become a historian of policing, and I don't know that I really would have identified as one until somewhat late in my professional development. And I might even resist that title a little bit. But, the original interests that drove Badges Without Borders were interests in state power, empire, racism, and especially the kind of entangled relationship between foreign and domestic policy, which was an interest that I had kind of maintained all the way back from the 1990s when I was in college, based on, just a little bit of work that I did in college. And so that point of thinking about foreign policy and domestic policy together was what started the research that became Badges Without Borders. And the research didn't really become primarily a history of policing until a few years into the process of developing that book. The book focused on the Office of Public Safety, which was the United States police training and assistance arm during the Cold War. And I think that when I set out on the research that became my dissertation, I don't think I knew what the Office of Public Safety was, when I wrote my dissertation proposal. So, I had the word counterinsurgency in my head. I was thinking about like militarization of policing. That was kind of a term that people were using at the time. Yeah. This was 2012 or 2011 even. But I was a little bit more interested in the military. I was interested in counterinsurgency. Obviously, this was kind of like the later period of the Iraq War. So policing came a little later. But it is true that I had an interest in policing. In Blue Power, I have this discussion of the kind of sociological or social scientific research about policing that went on in the 1950s and 60s, where like social scientists were trying to figure out like what is it that makes cops tick, and why is it that police are, authoritarian or have right-wing politics. And like the question was sort of, as I put it in the book, it's like, were authoritarian and right-wing young men attracted to becoming cops, or did being a cop, the experience of being a cop, turn you authoritarian and right wing? And so, I guess I could kind of like turn that kind of question on myself. And the flip side, it's like, was I a sort of like anti-authoritarian, anti-cop young person who then was attracted to punk, or, was like being a punk and like dressing weird and getting into, having bad experiences with police as a result of, just kind of being a like teenage miscreant in the suburbs, like in the 1990s, like did that, nourish my anti-cop, like anti-authoritarian beliefs. I mean, in the 1990s, Mumia Abu-Jamal, like if you were even remotely on the left or in kind of sort of subcultural spaces, it was hard to avoid, especially on the East Coast, Mumia. And so I was really interested in Mumia. I read a lot about him. A little bit later, toward the end of the 90s, the Abner Louima and then Amadou Diallo cases in New York City, which I write about in the book, like those, it was impossible to avoid those stories. Like if you turned on the TV news, growing up in the New York City area as I did. So, but yeah, I mean, I had bad experiences with cops as a teenager. It's kind of funny. Denville, New Jersey, which is just a kind of random suburb in New Jersey, where it was kind of like a town in between where I lived and like my best friend Dave lived. And so we would hang out in between in Denville. And the Denville Police Department, something like 16 or 18 cops in the Denville Police Department won the lottery in the 90s. So they like, a bunch of them got rich, right? They each won, I think of like, $1.5 million or something like that they got as an annuity. And some of the cops didn't go in on the winning ticket. And I had this run-in with this one Denville cop where he was just like he accused me and my friends of writing graffiti, which we hadn't, at least at that moment. Sure. And he like threw us on the ground and like, kind of like aggressively searched us and ripped our clothes. And, and I was just like, I remember like, this was the internet didn't really exist at the time, but I tried to do some research into that cop after that incident. And I think that I figured out like he was not one of the people who was in the winning lottery ticket. Not that I like had some sympathy, but I was like, well, of course this guy's going to be a dick, So, whatever, like, I don't mean to like make it seem like I had some, horrendous experiences with cops, because obviously they can be a lot worse. But, it was the case that if you were a like kind of like subcultural kid with like a bad haircut and messed up clothes, and you were just like hanging out after dark in the burbs, like, cops would harass you. They had nothing else to do. We had nothing to do. They had nothing to do. So we were gonna, run into each other. And so, yeah, like that, if anything, it just kind of confirmed like, okay, yeah, like the lyrics I'm like, humming in my head or whatever are being confirmed by my experiences of dealing with these, asshole cops. So, but yeah, like I wouldn't say that I went from, my like teenage experiences to then like the dissertation. There was a much more circuitous pathway. And then, ultimately, like, because Badges Without Borders came out in 2019, and then the pandemic happened, when I remember, like March, April of 2020, I was like, well, shit, like I decided to write about the wrong topic. Like nobody will ever care about police ever again. I should have studied, public health or whatever. And then it was, it was the case that the largest protests against police in the country's history, soon happened. And I was, I started, writing a lot more, and ultimately that led to the start of what became Blue Power. I had already done a little bit of the research for Blue Power, and I'd already written an article that was on some of this terrain, but I was not, if you had talked to me in April and asked me like, are you going to write another book about police? I would have said like, no way. And then by, June or July of 2020, it was like, okay, yeah, I'm definitely going to write another book about police. But it also took me a few years to finish it. But yeah, so that was the trajectory. And I would just say about the last part of your question about like what are other people missing. I mean, I think both of these books are very much pointedly answering that question by saying in Badges Without Borders, people are missing the question of U.S. empire. And with Blue Power, people are missing the political mobilizations, machinations of police, and in particular, but not exclusively, like the centrality of the police union as an institution within the broader institution of the police that we, I think that like everybody kind of, especially historians or, social scientists who write about police, everybody knows that police unions are there, that they matter, but exactly how and like what they do, they remain a bit of a black box. Like on some level, I think, the vanishing local reporter, the kind of like crime beat reporter who really like got to know the key players in like local politics, like that person would know a lot about police unions. But scholars have struggled, and it's not easy to figure out how to study them and write about them. And I did the best I could. I think I did pretty well, but there still are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And obviously, different people would ask different questions. A lawyer or legal scholar would ask different questions than I ask. But yeah, police are already hard to study. It's just like the military is easy as compared to the police. The military's history is celebrated. They write their own official histories. They make their archives generally available. Of course, there's always going to be stuff that's classified, but police just don't do that. They just don't let you into their archives if they even keep their archives. They try to hide them. They destroy them. And then police unions are not even subject to the little bit of kind of public record laws, that allow access because they're separate entities. And so it's just really, really hard for historians whose projects kind of, live or die based on accessibility of archival records. And so, I think that hopefully this book will shine a bit of a light on a pathway to doing more research in this vein. And certainly I know that there are other scholars who are working on this. Aaron Beckmeyer is writing a book about the politics of police in Philly and the FOP there. Imani Radney has just finished a dissertation about the police union in New York City, the PBA. So other people are doing this work, and I think that hopefully we'll start to see a lot more of it.
I'm just so glad that work is happening, and I'm so grateful to you for all your work and for this book in particular, which really does. Well, let me just address the listeners here and just feel like if anyone is simply existing in the world where they are or had any type of interaction abstractly or directly with the institutions of policing wherever they are and has questions about the broader national landscape, or has questions like, well, what's the FOP versus the PBA, right? Or how are police unions different from other unions? Or sure seems like cops have certain politics. Yours is the book to read.
Yeah, this is the book.
It's in some ways gobsmacking that history has not been localized and centralized in some place, and the amount of effort that you've had to put into that and against the grain and barriers to do it is really remarkable. And so I'm just going to plug that to people. Just please, buy the book, listen. It's got great characters. You're a fantastic stylist. There's wonderful stuff in there in addition to the institutional history, which feels like the thing that anyone in this democracy should know, but doesn't somehow get. And that brings me to I'm kind of noticing these paradoxes or these themes. And this actually bears on what we talked about in the cold open to some extent, right? This sort of these questions of like ubiquity and visibility, but also almost precisely because the cops are everywhere and so such a touchstone, they're aspects of what they are that is just not reflected upon, right? It's like the kind of purloined letter thing. It's right in the center, but also we don't see it. And then against that, or a thing that sometimes mitigates that, is the way in which people do have points of contact with the police. Sometimes it could be decisive stuff like, growing up continually under their heel, or, being fortunate enough to also encounter them in situations that can be, you have friction with them, but also like, oh, well, this institution, they're not there to help me. And I, I'll own, just mirroring back to you, like, I think the first time anyone ever pointed a gun at me was a cop. And I was just like, okay, this is nuts. This guy is completely just power tripping. This shouldn't be like that. But like, I'd not had that experience prior to that, but it was enough. Or other people may be like, oh, here in the public square, the police are doing something that we've never seen them do before, that I've never seen them do before. And now it becomes salient. I need to start reflecting on this. But in all these cases, there's kind of this implicit sort of, I don't want to use the language of counterinsurgency here, but there's like a big muddled middle, or there's like a point where you're just moving in society. And if you don't encounter it and it isn't made politically salient to you, and you don't have to think about the cops as political actors, you can just keep going, right? It's only at the point where there is some encounter or
friction.
You have to do something about that. You have to process it somehow. And again, what I want to register as an appreciation about your work is that on the one hand, I think understandably people have a tendency to fall into kind of presentism, being like, oh my God, the cops, before I had this bad encounter with the cops must have just been good, but something's happened since then, right? Or part of what's so remarkable about Badges Without Borders was as an intervention into the question of like militarization, right? The cops are behaving more and more like the military. You're able to speak to that and speak to real trends and material and institutions, but also be like, this is not just a Bush era thing, right? Or this is an Obama continuity thing, or this has to do with the war on drugs. Like this ability to think about deep structures that are incredibly powerful, but that go unmarked, and like symptomatic enactments, but that are just the tip of the iceberg. And to think about both those things at the same time seems like so much work, and yet you pull it off.
Yeah, thanks. I do think that we, meaning just regular people, have a tendency to, naturalize the world around us in all kinds of ways. And so police certainly, fall into that. And yeah, you're right that like a lot of people, I think they don't really stop to ponder or ask, questions about like what police are doing until something happens that is, they kind of like intuitively feel like, well, I've experienced an injustice or whatever. And, the liberal response to this is the kind of procedural justice framework where it's like, okay, you have an encounter with the police, you feel like you didn't get to tell your side of the story, they didn't respect you, you didn't get the information that you wanted. So how do we fix that problem? We make it so that in every encounter, police respectfully listen to the person they're arresting or whatever they're doing, summoning. They listen, they give their name and badge number, they tell people what's going to happen next, how to follow up, like whatever. All of that has been the reflexive liberal response. Like, let's institute a set of policies and procedures and trainings that go along with that, and this will solve the problem. And like what ends up happening is that on the one hand, police, the way that police get tried, that they try to convince police to go along with this is like, well, this will help with compliance. People will obey you and not argue with you if you're, more transparent, kind, blah, blah, blah. And then for the people on the other side, the explanation is like, you're going to come away, even if you ultimately get arrested and go to jail, you're going to feel good about it because it was transparent and fair and procedurally just, right? And I think that like it makes sense if you just like isolate every individual police encounter and there's no before or after, there's no history, there's no deep structure, whatever, there's no racism in the United States, there's no capitalism, whatever. Like, sure, it's perfect if it's just in this kind of hermetically sealed bubble, but in fact, that's not what happened. And so why somebody gets stopped, what expectations they bring to the stop, how the police officer reads the situation based on their like either training or experience or some other kinds of cues, all of that goes into it. And so there's a really good book that I've taught many times that is kind of about procedural justice, where these researchers basically they're like they go into it thinking like, yeah, this is the kind of solution to the problem, and they find like, oh, actually it doesn't work, because even when people are treated in a procedurally just way, they're still like, well, yeah, but fuck the cops, like they're all racist, like, okay, yeah, sure, that time they were polite to me, but that was just an act, or that was just that particular officer. Like, no, I don't buy it. So whatever, you can kind of like go down that. And for people who are thinking critically, not just like historically, but anybody who wants to think critically about our kind of governing institutions, like, yeah, I think it's our responsibility to step back and think about these kind of underlying structures and kind of occult forces that are not on the surface and do actually shape, condition, determine, outcomes in patterned ways. And, I think that like in this book, I make this distinction between operational power and political power of police. And we have a pretty good, particularly after say like 2014, 2015, or 2020, all of the scholarship, journalism, movement work that's been done to explain police operations. I think we have a good understanding of it. It's really important. I that is like the terrain on which I've myself been thinking for a while. But the question of political power of police is one that we have been less attuned to, even as I think it's been like so glaringly obvious and in our faces. It's like George Floyd gets killed. Everybody is more or less able to intuitively understand that an injustice has occurred. It's in front of our eyes. And then the police union to which his killer belongs gets out and makes all of these extremely belligerent racist statements to defend the officer, to impugn Floyd. That the head of that police union, Bob Kroll, famously gets told by the mayor, you can't go on stage with Trump wearing your police uniform. So he says, okay, I'm going to make shirts that say cops for Trump, and I'm going to distribute them to all my buddies, and we're going to sell them on the internet and whatever. And so there are these photos of, Trump shaking hands with Kroll, the guy who is, the number one defender of the Minneapolis Police Department. And also the number one enabler, of the types of abuse that George Floyd was one example. There's thousands of examples in that city of, outrageous abuse by police that were enabled and protected by, figures like Kroll. And so to the degree that like everybody sees, the picture of Trump shaking hands with a dude, big burly dude wearing a Cops for Trump shirt, like we don't have a robust understanding, let alone scholarly literature on what the hell is going on there. And so, I make this distinction to say, like, we need to think of the two together. It's not that we need to do one versus the other. It's that you can't understand the contemporary operational power of police without understanding the political power that they mobilize to protect their operational ability. Their discretionary authority is protected in part by law, but in large part by political power, right? And so that is what we need to make better sense of. And I try to show in the book that since the 1960s, at least, there has been this really well organized, somewhat comprehensive, if not the same everywhere. It's variegated to some degree by geography and whatever, but it's pretty much everywhere in the US. There's been this movement, which I call Blue Power, to politically protect, empower, and sanctify police discretion, police activity, coercive activity of police, which is necessarily going to result in people suffering injustice. So it's like, again, to go back to the procedural justice idea, the liberal reform idea, like there's no room within that kind of what I would basically call a fairy tale, kind of concocted in the minds of like, Tom Tyler, a Yale professor of psychology, I think, who kind of codifies the procedural justice. Like there's no room in there for a police union that is going to say like, A, we don't want to get more training. And if you're going to give us more training, you're going to have to pay us more. And B, we don't want to fill out forms. And if you're going to make us fill out forms, we have to get paid overtime. And C, if we don't follow this procedural justice model, you can't punish us for not following it. And then if you do punish us, well, we're all going to just stop issuing tickets or, go on strike or whatever. We're going to make the mayor's life miserable. We're going to attack, people on social media, blah, blah, blah. You go down the list of like all of these things that happen over and over again in the book. And so, yeah, like that is the reality of what policing looks like today. Whereas, the liberal reformers, I think, really are, like they're just like living in this fantasy where none of this stuff exists, right? And neither the deep history and structure nor the political power of police that I try to bring to the fore in the book.
Methodologically speaking, your use of internal police documents, I think, is really revelatory. And I mean, I think that was a word that came to me a couple of times, not because I haven't like spent time thinking about the police, but, as you talk about like rethinking or thinking more critically about police, like I think it's also a question of like structures of feeling, right? Of like unlearning ways that you are supposed to feel. So that those things are like very much mutually imbricated. And it's one thing to say, think differently. It's another thing to be like, well, a whole lot of children were taught that this equals safety. Or like, and here I'm going to say something like embarrassing as a child. Like I always just thought because the Policemen's Benevolent Association had the word benevolent in it, that it had to be benevolent. Like when I was a little kid, I was like, well, they say they're doing good. So, but it never occurred to me that who they were doing good for was themselves. like I know that's so silly, but I'm thinking about like 7 or 8-year-old Abby, like answering the phone, and now they call me and I'm like, fuck you, take me off your list and never call me again. But there are these little things where like, cops that go into certain schools to teach certain children that they are on their team, right? And those are structures of feeling that have to be unlearned in relation to the kind of rethinking that we're talking about. And so I guess, as I was reading your book, and in particular, in relation to all of these internal documents that were never meant for my eyes, right? And that really forcefully make the case that the police are trying, as the subtitle of your book says, to protect and serve themselves, right? Like that is the object of the benevolence, right? I really thought a lot about the language of revelation, of revealing, and of like unmasking, and that this book is doing a lot of work of unmasking, above all, the police, like air quotes, the police, isn't this sort of monolithic entity or something that's always existed, but instead, as you show very clearly and very painstakingly in the book, which manages to cover so much territory, not only like, and I mean that also literally in terms of like geographical territory, because all of the stories of police departments in a way are local stories, right? But like the way that you show how when people say the police, what they're actually naming is this sort of assemblage of institutions that are the product of these contingent historical circumstances whose role and necessity isn't given, but that's contested, imposed, and like continually made and remade. Can you help our listeners wrap their heads around some of the contingencies of modern American policing?
I almost want to ask you to tell it to us like we're children. And if you'll permit me, I had an experience reading your first book, Bachelor Without Borders, where you describe like the history of calling 911, right? And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear that too. But like, I was just thinking about how this gesture, as Abby is saying, that is like cultivated, that couldn't be more reflexive than problem, crisis, phone, call, cop, right? That doesn't just have a history in the first place, but has a very particular history. And yet somehow that had just been like, that's what you're supposed to do, right? It's ingrained. So you could speak
because
to us like
the child is actually an important figure here, like in terms of, and different children, differently situated, learn very early different things about who and what the police are and who and what they're for.
So gently and firmly, if you could disabuse our inner ideological children as to the contingency of the American police, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay, so maybe not for children, but for college students at least, which is the kind of where I'm usually pitching my remarks. I always teach my students that the process or practice or activity of policing and the institution we call the police can be and should be disentangled. The activity policing has a very, very long history, and like the term itself, when people like Adam Smith, the kind of famous political philosophers of the incipients of capitalism, when they used the word police, they were not referring to the institution of guys with, blue uniforms and a peaked cap and, handcuffs or whatever, right? Badge. They were talking about an activity, and the institution that we call the police developed later. It developed, for the most part in the 19th century with the rise of capitalism. And that is a history that is well worth thinking about, and many people have analyzed it. But for our purposes, the point is just to say that like the institution where there is a person who is a professional police officer who is a member of an institution of other professional police officers, is a relatively new invention. It's not that old. It's like we're about to celebrate, maybe celebrate's the wrong word. We're about to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States, right? I think 250, is that right? Yeah.
It sounds like enough. Yeah. It's been a good run.
Like the police.
I hear there's a really clear reflecting pool that's ready to mirror us back to ourselves.
Surrounded by police, in fact,
yes.
actually. So like that institution is like 150 years old or whatever. It's like we think of it as so essential to modern social life. It's like it's unimaginable. In fact, like you can't abolish this thing because it's so unimaginable to have modern social life without it. We can't even cut its budget because it's so essential, right? But actually, it's pretty new. And blue power, the political mobilization that I write about in the book, I would also emphasize is very, very new. Like I often say, like my mom, when she was in college, blue power as such didn't exist yet. It was in formation in the middle of the 1960s and didn't really come into existence and get the name until the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so it's, within the lifetime of my mom, this, who is a boomer or she's an old boomer, but, it's like this thing came into existence. So that I think that kind of like novelty is worth noting. But I would also just say, for the purposes of thinking from the left about about the problem of the institution of police, I think it's also valuable to make that critical analytic separation between like policing the activity and the institution of police, because the political problem that the book grapples with is the institution engaging in political activities, drawing on the public purse for purposes that I would say are distant from or even, unrelated to the activity of policing. Policing, again, to go back to what somebody, Adam Smith or whatever, like, you name your favorite philosopher of yore, when they said police, they were talking about the kind of present and future safety and even prosperity of a kind of collectivity, whether it was a family or a neighborhood or a town or a kingdom. Police was the activity to ensure that. And so if we think in those terms, like for the left, there is this ongoing question of like what to do about the police, the institution. And if we say like, well, what we want is policing in that classic sense, a police power, which is about ensuring the safety and prosperity in the sense of like fulfillment, life fulfillment of a collectivity, like then you can say, well, what we need is that activity arrayed against the institution of the police, which is actually an impediment to our flourishing and our actual safety, and certainly, obviously, some groups and communities more than others. But, so I do think that, this distinction is important and helps us to, again, like make sense as we try to think about like what is, like you said, this kind of contingent institutional formation that we have in the United States, where we nominally don't have federal police until Donald Trump came along or whatever. That's like certainly one story that we're told. But mostly we have municipal police, state police, county sheriffs, and then also library police, school police, train police, harbor police. You just go down the list. So we actually have a lot of different police institutions that are not unified, that all have their own political agendas. Some of them work with one another, and some of them are fairly independent from one another and in competition with one another. And in the book, I show it at various moments when that competition became kind of fierce between police who had different missions or jurisdictions or whatever, because they rightly or wrongly saw things in zero-sum terms. It's like if the sheriffs are getting more money from taxpayers, then the state police are getting less or whatever. And so that kind of fueled the sort of political battles that they engaged in. So yeah, I think there are a lot of distinctions that we can draw that help us make sense of this. At the same time, I also think that there is a certain irreducibility of that police activity of the discretionary application of coercive force to gain compliance. Like that's the same everywhere. I mean, I would go as far as to say it's the same all over the globe. Like there's not that much to be gained analytically or critically or politically from saying like, oh yeah, like cops are different in New York City from, rural Alabama or whatever. Like, no, it's like they're engaged in discretionary activity to gain compliance, according to the situation. Right. But they might, as I say in the book, be engaged in a kind of political contest where cops in New York are not going to politically unify with cops in Alabama, because the greatest fear that cops in New York have would be that they would get paid what cops in Alabama get paid. Like they're never going to extend solidarity across those geographies. And that's, that's another key story that comes out through the book, like the protecting and serving themselves attitude and imperative is a very kind of like inward looking one where expressing solidarity in outward fashion is actually relatively rare for police. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric and kind of political propaganda put out about the support that police have for one another. But when you get down to brass tacks or spreadsheets and the bottom line, that ends quite quickly.
I want to linger also with the title as well as the subtitle of the book, because Blue Power, which great title, by the way, it gives a name to what is an incredibly powerful social and political movement. And I think the naming is vital in no small part because the politics of policing and the political agency of the police are, and I think Patrick alluded to this earlier, they're at once ubiquitous, but also ubiquitously effaced, right? So as you observe in the book, it should be obvious that when police break up any protest, that this is a politically salient act. And when it's a protest against the police, specifically, like all the more so. But somehow, when it comes to the police, mainstream discourse, mainstream narratives, they continually transmute the actions of police into reactions, no matter how proactive they actually are. And they position the police as simultaneously like above and outside civil society and political struggles, but also as like the unquestionable precondition of those things. So Americans are continually asked to identify with the police, to stand with them, but also to see them as set apart, to arm them endlessly while seeing them as singularly vulnerable. And by the same token, as your book explores the ways in which police unions and other advocacy institutions have secured preferential treatment and enjoy bipartisan support, like there's just no analogy with any other profession. So I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about these paradoxes of solidarity, identification, and exception, and how you see them playing out in the recent past and in the present. And to throw a little Freud in there, what is it about the police that generates so much of what Freud would call kettle logic, and that makes so many people just kind of check their critical thinking when that master signifier of the police is invoked?
So blue power is a term that I found in the research. It was a term that was used both by some police militant political activists within the police, as well as journalists and people who were trying to kind of make sense of what was going on toward the end of the 1960s. So obviously, this is the era of Black Power. Police themselves were very wary of Black Power. They saw Black Power as fundamentally an attack on police. But, police also have seen lots of things as an attack on police, like the Supreme Court in the 1960s was attacking police with its decisions, like the Miranda decision, which everybody knows from TV because people get read their Miranda rights. Like, that was seen as a real danger to police because it would empower or protect, criminal suspects, right? So they have had a long history of finding political and social transformation to be worrisome. Black Power was the latest example in the 1960s, but also in some ways perhaps the most fearsome because it was so explicit about the problem of policing and the racism of police institutions. And so there were lots of incidents where police, I would say, provoked violence that ended up getting police hurt or killed. And so that was what they understood as the threat of Black Power. It was both a political threat and an actual physical threat of violence. So Carl Parcell, who was the president of the Detroit Police Officers Association, who I write about a fair amount in the outset of the book, he was one of the people who disseminated the term blue power. And he was very explicit that when I say blue power, I'm saying it in reaction to black power.
Mhm.
If he doesn't put it in these exact terms, but if black people can have black power as a response, we can have blue power. So we're going to politically mobilize. And, the people who wrote about it at the time, journalists and other people who were trying to make sense of the public sector union movement, which was growing at the same moment, and police were taking advantage of changes to law in state after state and cities where they were now able to unionize to gain collective bargaining rights. So people were trying to make sense of this. And I think the assumption really was that once police are able to unionize and gain collectively bargained contracts, this political movement that they called, and I'm calling blue power, would go away. It would basically be satisfied. Most unions, when they get a contract, they calm down. They cease their militancy. Maybe when the contract is up for renegotiation, they mobilize. But in general, the history of the labor movement was a history of, kind of pacification through, legal measures that labor law is a whole set of legal measures to kind of pacify the labor movement. And so police would similarly be pacified by a contract and the various other procedures and protections that they were seeking. Well, that turned out not to be the case. And so blue power, as I demonstrate in the book, is this multi-decade long process and mobilization to protect and enhance the police. And it's an ongoing political mobilization. Blue power is both the medium through which they get what they want, and it's also the outcome. It's the kind of objective of what they want. They want to remain empowered to, some scholars have used this term super citizen. I don't use that term, but it's like they want to be set apart and to be treated as a kind of protected class. And even in the conversations about the end of affirmative action by decree of the Roberts Court, they're at the very same time that there were all of these right-wing mobilizations and other mobilizations to finally put an end to affirmative action. At the very same moment, after 2020, there's all this effort to put into place hate crime legislation where cops would be a protected class. And so I think, you two are the experts on psychoanalysis. So maybe we can think that through. Yeah. But it's consistent with a much broader sweep of political mobilization by police to empower themselves over and above the rest of society.
That's so clarifying and helpful. And part of the reason also I was so glad to have you on the show today is just the desire to reality check or do some type of sanity testing.
Reality testing.
Yeah. Because it's both because one, I have, we all have, I think, have impulses where someone's like, well, unions are great. Yeah, I'm definitely union strong, right? Solidarity forever. And sure, I guess, a cop shop is a workplace, but also, as you've historically indicated, cop unions are not the same as other unions. And as you observe in the book, right, very few other unions all the protesters go to a protest armed, right? Or negotiate with the state while also being able to do things like, well, hell, as you've given the incredibly harrowing description, like kill Harvey Milk, right, or dox the mayor's daughter after they arrest her at a protesting you, right? It's there, or even you given this analogy of the structural sort of power relations. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read you to you. Typically, a labor strike occurs in response to incommensurable positions held by management and workers, when well-organized workers believe the only way to achieve their goals of better working conditions and compensation is to withhold labor, hitting the boss in their wallet. The analogy is imperfect with police. The wallet is the revenue garnered from taxpayers, and taxpayers are also the ones potentially hurt, though they are not the boss. That is what makes police distinctive. They cannot be voted out, and they constantly rebuke directives from elected officials. Their operational power is impervious to democratic control or almost any external levers. Think I'm wrong? Try saying no to a cop next time he or she tells you to stop what you are doing. You might be able to do it as a big group in the form of protest or uprising, but all the people in the group will then be liable to be called criminals. It's just so clarifying, but like,
Yeah, I have that passage flagged too.
It's just, damn, man. It just cuts right to the quick. But it is that like bracingly clear power relationship is somehow, maybe because it is so ubiquitous, maybe because there is so much propaganda, maybe even because like right when they do something horrible, they don't dial it back, but just get even more aggressive, right? Like there's a kind of hysterical logic that is a logic. And like, well, when we're choking the life out of people in the public square, then we're going to show up wearing the t-shirt saying, we can breathe, fuck you, or whatever. And that somehow
and also we make the public square possible.
Yeah, it's, you have that line, one of these cops being like, cops represent society. When you attack cops, you are attacking society, even as what they're basically doing is like literally or figuratively holding a gun to the very existence of public discourse or like public protest.
Or choking the life out of the citizens of the polity. Yeah.
Even with the psychoanalytic tools, I find myself being like, it really is like that. But also, if it really is like that, that's fucking terrifying. I'm scared to think about it too much. I'm scared to talk about it. I'm scared about the prospect of living it. But this basic way in which not just like the violence of order maintenance isn't registered as violence, right? I think Rebecca Traister said this very nicely, but like just that there's the mind kind of reels at the totality of it, or even like you feel like it, or even if having had all these, the way it gets pushed into other conversations where people being like, oh, all you professors and you're all making, six figures or whatever, and you only work 9 months a year. And I'm like, no, that's what a cop in Boston makes, not what an adjunct does, right? But somehow it's like the fantasy in its full counterfactual status. Hell, even the way people are like, we're defunding the police. No police departments have been defunded. Both parties they literally compete to give the police more money. That's all they do.
After all of that clarity, right, I can turn on the television and like watch, I don't know, even a show where like obviously the cops are like corrupt and shitty. And you're like, oh, I'm still rooting for Jimmy McNulty. Right? Even though he's like drunk on the job and obviously corrupt, right? What is it that despite, these sort of mountains of evidence that we have about like the real kind of raison d'etre of police that still encourage us to turn on a television show and be like, there is a moral order in the universe and the cop stands for good.
I hate to throw the sayings to him. We're like, like complicity, like participation, shared benefits,
but it's like how they do that. Like that's like the question is like how they do that.
Well, look, police have a lot of resources at their disposal, particularly in big cities, to shape narratives. And in some sense, it's even to shape, kind of reality, like our understanding of what's going on. And so, there's this really good recent book by a sociologist, Tony Chang, called it The Policing Machine, I believe. And, and he writes about the NYPD. He wanted to research the NYPD and they wouldn't let him in any way, shape, or form.
That. Yeah.
And so what he ended up doing was kind of embedding in these community meetings, because in every precinct in New York City, there is a kind of designated body that is the representative of the community that can bring its concerns to the police. Except the thing is that the people who are on that representative body are chosen by the NYPD. If you are a vociferous critic of the police, or you show up wearing a shirt that says, like, fuck the police, or you show up wearing a body count t-shirt, like they're not going to let you be on that body. And if something happens, if there is an incident in that precinct, they will go into overdrive, mobilizing this constituency, which is often composed of like clergy, business owners, kind of like people who I would say are not representative of the majority of people in any given precinct. And, they'll go into overdrive trying to make an argument about the great works that the police department has done. They've thrown a barbecue, they threw a street party, they got a bouncy castle, they had a band or whatever. Like that's what the NYPD is doing in the precinct. Like that guy who got shot, well, he was a drug addicted, 4-time felon or whatever. It's like the words don't have to come out of the mouth of the NYPD spokesman, although they will. They'll also come out of the kind of like local representative body, right? And so anyway, that's somebody else's research that I found really, really insightful. He doesn't talk about in that book about police unions. So I think it's complementary to the work I do. But there's also the work that police unions engage in. And one of the things I found in my research that I was really kind of astonished to learn is how connected these are. Again, like I said, it's not a connection necessarily of solidarity, but it's a connection of info sharing, resource sharing in you name the town, whatever, like Seattle. We had this experience, this worked, this didn't work. Going to write about it in our newsletter and mail it out to cops across the country so that you can also learn from what we did and do the exact same thing. We're going to create model legislation. We're going to create model union contracts and disseminate them across the country. And so particularly in the 1970s, I found that there were these developing networks that were sharing ideas about like how police can obtain political power and then to bring it up to the present and where we are with the kind of question of just like shaping public perception and sort of shaping reality. I think that these organizations are learning from one another. They're talking to one another. They're creating kind of best practices. That doesn't mean that they don't necessarily go rogue sometimes, or that crisis situations don't emerge, that they have to kind of like think on their feet. But they even develop these blueprints for like what to do if something goes wrong. And and I talk in the book, and I think in the discussion of body count and the protests by police against the record label, and they say like, well, if not that many people show up at your protest, as happened when they were trying to protest the record label, because in fact, cops didn't really give that much of a shit to go to Hollywood to protest the record label. Well, don't say that it's, a mass demonstration, say that it's a kind of representative sample or, whatever. I don't remember the exact term they use, but, so it's like.
This is when they were protesting the song. Yes.
Right, yeah. They wanted the cop killer. Yeah. That's a track.
Yeah. So it's like they're thinking, okay, I guess this is something, I want to be careful about saying that like the left can learn tactics here because, and I'm explicit in the book about how to think about this more carefully. But the one thing I would just say is that like they're relentless and they turn losses into wins really, really frequently. They don't let losses be setbacks. It's just like, okay, we didn't get the bill we wanted passed in this legislative session. So how do we get it passed next legislative session? And, of course, there are many grassroots social movements and NGOs and all the rest who know that persistence matters. But I do think that, there is a real persistence in kind of political tactics that I document throughout the book that is remarkable. And it's a kind of disposition. Certainly it's easy perhaps to do that when you're getting paid to be relentless. It's like your whole job is to just like never give up. If you're the police union, political affairs director or whatever, like that's your job. But it's like, how do you keep a constituency mobilized when you lose is a real challenge. And, I honestly think that in the present, like 2026, this actually is a bit of a conundrum for police. I think that they are on the one hand, they're in a situation where they've won a lot and they're not really under threat politically the way that they seem to have been in 2020, but they really want to hold on to that feeling of being under threat because it was very helpful for kind of mobilization. It's like, oh, these crazy commies are taking over and they're going to ruin our livelihoods. They're going to take away our pensions. They're going to take away our legal protections, blah, blah, blah. So like, we got to be mobilized and organized to counteract that. And what's happened subsequently, it's like all of the widely available data shows this, is that police departments have had, lots and lots of people resign, retire. They've had a lot of trouble with recruitment. And so, yeah, that is potentially an effect of the public criticism of police. I can certainly understand why people who may have said, oh, hey, I want to become a cop because it's a relatively easy job. You get paid a lot of money. You do 20 years and then, you retire by like age 45 or whatever, and you get a pension for the rest of your life or whatever. So like people who were not like, again, really interested in the job of policing, they were just interested in stable kind of, well-compensated employment. Those people may now be dissuaded from becoming cops because of the public political consciousness that was raised by the protests of 2020. But I think that will also ebb over time. And the political organizations that I analyze in the book are they stand ready to take advantage of any eventuality that will occur. And they will try to mobilize people again under the banner that like police are under attack, police are under threat. And, ironically, I think that one of the biggest threats for like city police right now is ICE. I don't know, maybe that's not ironic, but ICE is offering hiring bonuses that are bigger than, in some cases, the salaries that, annual salary that like some police departments are offering. And so I do think that, yeah, sure, there's like Groyper Nazi weirdos who are joining ICE, but there are also some people who are quitting police departments to join ICE because it maybe, seems like that's where the action is. Although I think the, heroic resistance of Minneapolis maybe put a damper on that to some degree. But yeah, like this is a place where you can get paid a lot of money, be well supported, and not face the annoying BS that a cop in a city has to deal with, which of course, 94% of their day is they're dealing with everything but crime, so, if you join ICE and if you watch the commercials that ICE is putting out, like you spend 24 hours a day going after terrorists, international rings of sex traffickers, blah, 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 all of that, it's like, I think people don't necessarily always believe that propaganda, but yeah, so there are these dynamics, just to say, when you kind of step back from all of this, again, this is something that the book is about, is making sense of the political relationships among these different types of groups and organizations under the broad heading of law enforcement, and how they mobilize their political agendas and how their political agendas work together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not so harmoniously.
I'm struck by these like lessons learned, or just thinking, I don't want to like opportunistically, like, what can cops teach us in some sort of like Robert Fulghum way? But I do think like it's something about like, on the one hand, it's a competitive ecosystem, as you described. They're fighting for federal grants. They're fighting with one another over, and some of them are just doing like wild corruption, right? The one guy who like drops $800,000 at a Trump casino, just amazing, right? Again, the characters in this book, folks, check it out. But they also like have this, as you described, they have this like there's a bottom line principle of not like solidarity, but of mutual recognition of their shared investment in a principle of impunity, no matter what, right? So whenever anyone steps out, no matter what they do, it's always full throttle defending their brothers and sisters in blue.
Yeah, and you know, I pay a lot of attention to the division within police departments between the command and the rank and file. You know, and I think that division is important for us to try to make sense of. It's not always the same everywhere over time. But nevertheless, at the same time, we also need to realize that like those divisions will be set aside and there will be consolidation in a moment of crisis, right? So the rank and file and the chiefs may be at odds until, you know, a cop kills somebody on camera, and then the disputes over the contract or whatever it is are going to be set aside for the moment, and they're gonna come to unify and consolidate.
Yeah, and I wonder if there is a distinction between like maybe this is what we're getting a case study in between, like, as you described, like relentless mobilization, always being out there, aggressive, even as your posture is being under assault, no matter what whatever. That's one thing. But like full hystericization, like seems like another kind of like level, right? I'm thinking about the cops who were bugging out because of like, you know, maybe they smelled fentanyl or something, right? Or even like the things that, as you described, like were being said about de Blasio by the PBA folks, or just like it's like tertiary syphilis kind of stuff. Like you can almost clear the spittle off your monitor from it. Like it's crazy. It's just not that level of intensity doesn't seem like that's sustainable, or at least you might think it's not sustainable. And I wonder if that's a potential sort of like point that we're like, I guess people just go to ICE that kind of sidesteps it, but like that does seem like we're at some sort of testing ground for that. Like how much can it just run on affect and a certain performance of the social role, and how much does it require some material sort of contact point within the institution?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is also just the kind of question about, you know, the Trump administration and MAGA, you know, more generally, which is also like very much powered by these seemingly unsustainable, extreme, and totally implausible ideas. But, you know, nevertheless, like people are still talking about ivermectin as the, you know, cure all or whatever. You know, it's like, so they develop their own momentum, you know, and I think that is certainly something that is true. And again, with policing, there is a whole sort of media ecosystem, you know, and it has overlap and affinities with the kind of MAGA media ecosystem. But it's like you can go online right now to like various, you know, police like media websites and find, I'm sure, stories about, you know, cops inhaling fentanyl. Like in you know, for us, this is just like something that we poke fun at, but there are good reasons for the purveyors of these ideas to like not brook any challenge that reality might pose. And I try to show in the book that the political culture of blue power is, like you say, it's exaggeration, hystericization, you know, whatever. Like it is over the top, uncompromising, and I think that is internal to it, but that also indexes the type of society that it's trying to produce. It's not trying to produce a orderly, calm, safe, you know, society, despite claims otherwise. Like it actually feeds off an intensely disordered and chaotic social situation, which is obviously what, you know, capitalism in 2026 is giving us. I mean, it's just like everything is off the rails, and that is actually a situation in which police are able to, on the one hand, like identify themselves as you know, sort of saviors, but then also just like pick and choose. You know, it's like so much is happening in, you know, our societies, our cities at any given moment that they can react how they want to react, and you know, that kind of protection of their prerogative, again, is like at the base of their politics. And so I want to insist, through the analysis that I've done, that like we need to try to think about what police are doing at any given moment as inflected by, if not, fully constituted by, a set of political engagements and choices and objectives. And once we look at police through that lens, I think it does give us a slightly different understanding of like what's going on. It's like, why is it that police don't seem to be like doing anything about this problem in my neighborhood or whatever? Like, it's not because they haven't thought about it. It's because they've made an active choice. And we should think of that choice as having a whole set of political underpinnings and ramifications. And, this is I think a slightly different way from how we were going back to, like what we were talking about earlier about like what you learned as a child. I mean, this is just not the way that we're trained to make sense of the world around us and the role of certainly the police within it.
You're teeing me up beautifully to ask the last question that I want to before we end, which takes us to the ending of the book. In these last chapters of Blue Power, you paint a really distressing and bleak, but also really clarifying picture. You argue that we're in this conjuncture where certain pretenses have been abandoned, where the theatrics and the rituals of Trumpism, like the naked cruelty and self-interest of it all, have meshed perfectly with the brutality of the police, who are literally fighting for themselves in the streets, on social media, and beyond. And I don't think it's putting it too strongly to say that you essentially propose that we're in the midst of an ongoing police riot or even a kind of hostage taking. So can we talk about this, about potential scenarios for the present and near future where you might see things going and even what your hopes might be?
So, yeah, the book ends on this point about the police after 2020 nationally basically going on strike, undeclared, but withdrawing their labor for the most part. And, there's a good amount of social scientific data to back this up. Of course, there's some controversy and it's some of it is difficult to measure. I mean, it doesn't mean that police stopped doing anything, but, in a lot of cities, the typical kind of visible patrol really ceased, and you had less visible forms of, plainclothes work that oftentimes led to really intense and outrageous abuses. The gun trace task force in Baltimore is kind of like the most famous example of this, where, it seems like basically what happened after not so much 2020, but even before 2020, because there was an uprising there in 2015, police more or less stopped policing. And to pick up the slack, the police department created this unit by putting together the most corrupt and violent cops all in one unit and just like set them free on the city. And the result was intense levels of abuse and violence. They were ultimately, most of them ended up in prison for, violence and selling drugs and guns and whatever. But they were effective in terms of numbers. They were like the most effective unit of the BPD in history, because if you don't have to adhere to the Fourth Amendment, if you don't have to adhere to any kind of constitutional protections or even the notion that you might be there to keep people safe, like, well, then you can just do whatever you want. They probably fudged the numbers too, but nevertheless, this was the situation. So again, it's not to say like policing in the United States ceased, but some forms of it ceased. The most kind of regular and pedestrian forms, traffic stops, other types of stops, ceased as a political response to the protests of 2020, as well as other things, vaccine mandates among them, where many police refused vaccine mandates, et cetera. So is that continuing in 2026? I think it's hard, it's hard to know for sure. The data are not great, and I think we will only know, a few years hence. But it does seem like it's alleviated or abated in some places, but maybe not everywhere. But then you also have something else that has happened in this period, which is the increasing election of like people who came into the public eye through 2020 or through, political protest against police. And they're getting elected to state legislatures and perhaps even, based on the primary results that just occurred in New York City, Congress as well. And then, the mayor of New York City, the mayor of Seattle. There are these quite progressive or self-identified democratic socialist mayors who have mounted very strong critiques of the police. I think that like one distinction that they would say is like, well, previously I was just the guy on Twitter. Now I'm the mayor of a big city. So it's like, I can't necessarily say the exact same things that I used to say. But the question then becomes like, well, what the hell do they do about the police?
Yeah.
And the logic of the book of Blue Power is to say that like they have to deal with the police as a political problem, not just a kind of like bureaucratic and kind of governance problem of like, okay, most of the way that mayors deal with police is like the business owners in this neighborhood are calling city hall because or calling the local precinct because there's vandalism or cars are getting stolen or whatever, or there have been some homicides, and so they're calling up and they're saying do something about this, right? And so that's how most city halls deal with policing. And of course, I don't think that we actually have great scholarship on this, but we know to some degree that like City Hall answers the calls of some interests more than others. They cultivate certain interests, and of course, big property owners are the most likely ones to get the phone answered. But so then the challenge of that governance issue in itself is that then the mayor says to the police chief, deal with the stolen cars in neighborhood X. The police chief then says to the captain, who says to the lieutenant, who says to the sergeant, who says to the beat cop, deal with the stolen cars. And the beat cop is like, whatever. Okay, cool. I don't know. Like, I would rather do something else. And they do something else because fundamentally they have extreme amounts of flexibility.
Candy Crush isn't going to play itself. You got,
but it's true that like, yes, they have to kind of like do what they're told. It's a hierarchical organization, but as you go down the rank hierarchy, they get more and more discretion, right? And so what that means is that maybe they stop the dude who looks like a car thief but isn't actually a car thief, or they do stop the car thief, or whatever. It's like there's a million permutations for how it plays out. But that's the governance problem that most mayors or elected officials, that's how they kind of like deal with it. It's somewhat intractable. The flexibility and discretion that police have to do or not do the crime control it exists, and they have to deal with it. But then we also have this political problem of like, what do you do if the police department or the institutions within it, namely the police unions, say, no, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do, or I will only do it under these conditions, under the conditions of, more pay, more overtime, blah, 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 like whatever kind of compensation issues that they might raise. And, I think that the elected socialists are trying to figure out how to navigate these. People on the far left, the ultra left, some of the critique is just like, well, DSA actually doesn't give a shit about solving the problems of police. And, okay, like you can encounter that argument and make of it what you will. But I think that like at the end of the day, there is this really difficult question to answer, which is like, how do you deal with an extremely powerful, mobilized, and entrenched political organization, both the police department itself and the unions that are semi-autonomous from the department itself, and sometimes even mobilize against the department, but also mobilize against the mayor by proxy or city council by proxy. How do you deal with this? And none of the new crop of progressive or democratic socialist elected officials has figured out the answer to this problem. I mean, I think in general, the answer that they want to propose is, let's reduce the responsibilities of police and pass some of them along to a different type of organization, a community safety, neighborhood safety type of organization that can supplement or augment or be an alternative as a, first responder that doesn't show up with guns and is trained in social work, addiction, blah, blah, blah. But, again, Baltimore's police budget, Baltimore has been fairly successful in mobilizing some of these organizations, doing harm reduction, doing violence interruption. And yet the Baltimore Police Department budget remains, more than $500 million every year. And the mayor's office of neighborhood safety and something, I don't know exactly what its budget is, but it's like a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that. It's not even 1%, right? So, and with my students, I do these kind of lessons where we just talk about like, okay, if you're the mayor, knowing what what we've learned about policing, imagine that mayors are actually all powerful, which they're absolutely not. But like, okay, how do we reallocate the budget? Take $500 million that goes to the Baltimore Police Department and like, let's cut it dramatically, and then use the other money for other purposes, and like in general, what my students come up with is not any different from, I think, what the mayor would come up with. But the students, it's like they say like housing, jobs, harm reduction, crisis response, whatever. But the problem is that like the mayor can't actually make those massive, massive cuts without provoking the police to make the city ungovernable, right? And that has happened over and over and over again in the history I document. There are so many instances, and I didn't even cover the full litany, but so many incidents of police going on strike, rioting, committing crimes, and even assassinating elected officials to get their way. I don't think that any mayor, and there are examples in the book, and there are some that I didn't include because they're somewhat hard to corroborate, but of people basically saying like, yeah, I campaigned on reining in the police, and then I got elected, and I got a call in the middle of the night that said, watch your back, right? So this is the political reality of the United States. Does that? I mean, yeah, these progressive officials are getting elected, but are we living in a democracy where they actually have the ability to govern, by the will of the people? Again, that is a question I might pose to my students. But yeah, so this is the situation. And, so do I despair? No, I'm hopeful. And I think, again, people on the left, comrades on the left, people, maybe they would say they're to my left, they would say like, no, fuck that. Like, don't be hopeful. Like, that's delusion. Mm-hmm. But, the ground is shifting beneath our feet. The ground is shifting for these organizations, the police unions. I have said that when the Sergeants Benevolent Association in New York City, doxed de Blasio's daughter, and in general was like super, super active and wild on Twitter, was that a mark of strength or was that a mark of weakness, right? Like, these are dudes who spend most of their time smoking cigars in back rooms, like literally, meeting with legislators in Albany, not in New York City, where they're used to getting their way because there's a certain kind of arrangement that everybody knows and respects. That arrangement is over, at least in New York State, it's over. And so they have to take to Twitter to try to get what they want. Now, that doesn't mean that, again, there's like radical social transformation happening as far as the NYPD goes. And I think that Mayor Mamdani, I think that we need to hold his feet to the fire and be critical. The DSA, put out its first statement criticizing the mayor over issues with the NYPD.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's notable, and I think it's the right thing to do. I think there needs to be further mobilization. But at the same time, I think there also needs to be a recognition that this is a massive, massive political challenge of urban governance. And to the degree that Blue Power, the book, can be helpful for making sense of our society and especially our cities, is to say, like, this has been brewing for decades and decades, and it is a concerted political mobilization. It's highly networked and very well resourced, and they have the blueprints already developed for how to get what they want. And so we can't, we ignore it at our peril. I wish that I didn't have to write this book. I wish somebody else had written this book before me and I didn't have to do it. But I had to answer this question for myself. Like, what is going on with the political power of police? Like, what are police unions about? Why is it that de Blasio's daughter is getting doxxed? Like, what's going on there? And so I started the research, and I started in the 1960s because that was what I knew best. And it turned out like, oh yeah, in Detroit, there's this dude named Carl Parcell who is like, I'm going to take it upon myself to destroy a progressive mayor and call that Blue Power. And what's the difference in 2026? Like, I don't really, I think that like, I don't know exactly that the police union president in a given city, Detroit or New York City, would put it in those exact terms. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But that was what Carl Parcell did. I mean, it was like, we're going to get a union, we're going to get a good contract, we're going to be the best paid cops in the country, but we're going to destroy this elected official in the process. And that became the blueprint, the Blue Power blueprint. And it's happened over and over and over again. And we still are, living in cities where that is the fear. That is what people are up against. And so hopefully what the book does is alert readers to the existence of this incredibly well organized and well entrenched political force across this country.
Well, Stuart, the book is remarkable and eye-opening, and thank you so much for making the time to come and talk with us about it. Before we go, where can people find you on the internet? And will there be a book tour, or people be able to see you talking about police unions in a city near them?
Yeah, thanks so much. Absolutely. Yeah, I am planning some events as we speak. I'll be talking again, most likely in New York City in early September. I'm going to be in Austin, Texas in early October. I'm working on events on the West Coast in maybe LA and the Bay Area, probably also Atlanta, Georgia, I think in November. So yeah, I will be taking the summer off mostly from book events, although obviously if anybody wants to invite me, I'll be happy to try to make it work. But then yeah, in the fall, I will be hitting the road and I'll be out there. And yeah, you can find me easily online if you want to get in touch.
This was phenomenal. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Stuart Schrader. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.